All right, so after months and months of millionaire coal baron Joe Manchin stringing along Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, changing his mind a million goddamn times, it now seems like we do have a reconciliation bill on the table that he is willing to support. So, here from Jake Sherman, he says Manchin says that he has reached an agreement with Chuck Schumer on a reconciliation deal that deals with climate, energy, tax, and healthcare. So he wrote this entire op-ed, or I guess this piece here, where he's getting into his justifications for putting forward what he is calling the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. But basically, just to summarize here, he focuses on a number of different things. Number one, Cold War II electric boogaloo with China, focuses very heavily on this bill being somehow a pushback to China's influence in the world. Number two, he focuses in again on pushing the idea that Build Back Better was somehow going to dramatically worsen inflation. Complete bullshit. But number three, one of the other main things he focuses in on here is specifically relating to the climate provisions in this bill, saying that they're going to be focusing in on a market-based approach to tackling climate change. So in other words, complete half-assed neoliberal measures to solving what is probably the single greatest threat facing not only the United States but the planet as we know it. So that's basically the outline of the justifications he was giving for putting forward this bill. So now what's actually in it? Well, here from Jeff Stein, he gives a very basic outline. So on tax policies, they're going to be raising, this is all the money they're raising from this, and this is the money they're going to be spending, but they say there's $313 billion from a 15% corporate minimum tax. I think that's pathetically low, but if it's actually enforced, it would be higher than what a lot of corporations are paying right now, which is literally zero. But also $288 billion in prescription drug reform. So this could be a good one, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Obviously, given that it's Joe Manchin, it's going to be dramatically scaled back than something that we would support or something that has been, for example, put forward by Bernie Sanders in the Senate. So dramatically scaled back prescription drug price reform, $124 billion for IRS tax enforcement. So this, at least in my opinion, would probably be the best of any of these, because we literally live in a country right now where the wealthiest and most powerful financial criminals in the country never get targeted by the IRS because they literally do not have the resources in order to go after them. So that could be a great thing. And also $14 billion for the carried interest loophole, which is basically just a loophole for investment managers who take their income in the form of stock payouts and capital gains, basically just closing a loophole that allows them to pay like a 20% rate instead of the normal 37% rate on their income. So that would be a great thing as well. And then on spending, they say $369 billion for energy and climate change. We're going to get to some more details on that. And $64 billion for an ACA extension. So overall, I mean, obviously completely watered down relative to what was previously on the table, but let's try to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. Not that he deserves any, ounce of that, but let's just read into some of the actual details here in terms of what is in this package. So here from Jeff Stein in the Washington Post, they say Manchin says that he has reached a deal with Schumer on the economy and climate. So they say under the deal, Schumer secured Manchin's support for roughly $433 billion in new spending, most of which is focused on climate change and clean energy production. It is the largest such investment in U.S. history. Not like you're really comparing that to anything. We really haven't had any major investments in climate change throughout our history, so kind of a weird thing to put in there. But they say it's also marked a departure from Manchin's position only days earlier, which I talked about on this channel, where he basically said no more tax increases, no more climate spending. And they say the Democrats coupled the spending with provisions that aim to lower healthcare costs for Americans, chiefly by allowing Medicare to begin negotiating the price of select prescription drugs on behalf of seniors. So again, it's pushing unnecessary austerity in this type of provision. It's not going to allow Medicare to negotiate all drug prices. It's not going to be making prescription drugs free for Medicare recipients or for the American people more broadly. So it's definitely significantly tamped down relative to what it could be. But they continue saying to pay for the package, Manchin and Schumer also settled on a series of changes to tax law that would raise $739 billion over the next decade, enough to offset the cost of the bill, while securing more than $300 billion for cutting the deficit, a priority for Manchin. This is just fucking ridiculous. I mean, listen, if you actually wanted to cut the deficit, how about you start with things like, I don't know, the Pentagon budget, which is like roughly $1 trillion a year at this point. The Pentagon still cannot pass an audit to tell us where that money is going. Basically a financial black hole in our military. military, which is by far the largest portion of our discretionary budget, but no word on how the military budget or our endless wars overseas, attribute to the deficit or the debt. No word on that, just when it comes to, actual investments in climate change or investments in working class people. So I think that's complete bullshit, but they say that Democrats source the funds from proposals including a new minimum tax on corporations, that 15%, and fresh investments in the IRS that will help it pursue tax cheats. And they say, but the new agreement still totals significantly less than Democrats had hoped to achieve through the more sweeping Build Back Better Act. And Manchin angered many colleagues when he scuttled his party's proposed overhaul to the country's healthcare, education, climate, immigration, and tax laws last December, a version of which passed in the House. And Manchin described that since abandoned plan in defiant terms on Wednesday. So here's what he had to say about Build Back Better in that little op-ed that he was writing. He said, "For too long, the reconciliation debate in Washington has been defined by how it can help advance Democrats' political agenda." That's kind of how politics works, yeah. Called Build Back Better. Manchin said in a lengthy statement referring to Democrats' initial larger spending package that bore Biden's 2020 campaign slogan. And he says, Build Back Better is dead, and instead we have the opportunity to make our country stronger by bringing Americans together. I mean, again, if you actually go and look at any of the provisions within Build Back Better, they were overwhelmingly supported not just by a broad bipartisan coalition of the American people, but even by a majority of Joe Manchin's own constituents in West Virginia, okay? And that's not just Democratic constituents, that's across the board, overwhelmingly favored literally every single major provision that was within Build Back Better. So the idea that you needed to tank or kill Build Back Better in order to pass your own bill here is just complete nonsense, okay? If you wanted something that could bring the American people together, you already had it on the table. You just didn't like some of the provisions that were in there because you are corrupt. I mean, let's call it what it is here, but they continue here saying Biden, meanwhile, described the legislation as historic, stressing in a statement that this is the action the American people have been waiting for. I don't think so, but the White House had issued its own ultimatum earlier this month, stressing that if Congress didn't act on climate change, that Biden would use executive orders to address the issue. So now this, I guess, is going to give Biden an out to where he no longer feels the pressure to use his executive power to tackle climate change. So that could be pretty disastrous in and of itself. But they say with an agreement in hand, Schumer soon to set about briefing members of his own party on the bill dubbed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. I mean, again, calling your bill this when we know for a fact that Build Back Better would have also reduced inflation, it's just kind of fucking ironic that, Biden's getting on board with this completely different bill that's just excluding a lot of his major policy priorities and promises that he ran on during his campaign in 2020, in the 2020 election. So, I mean, it's just kind of embarrassing that, like, you would let him call it this bill, you would get so fully on board with it, and that Manchin would even call it this. It's laughable at face value. He doesn't really care about reducing inflation. He just cares about using the narrative of inflation in order to push unnecessary austerity on working class people. But they say it came as a surprise to many Democratic lawmakers, illustrating the tumultuous and secretive negotiations between Schumer and Manchin. I mean, that's been the biggest problem, is that these have been secretive negotiations. You shouldn't have been doing this behind closed doors. The result of doing these behind closed doors secretive negotiations with somebody as bad faith and corrupt as Joe Manchin is that you're going to get a significantly watered down half-assed piece of legislation, which is, in my opinion, at least exactly what this is. But they give a little bit more details here on the energy provisions in it. They say the new bill provides billions in home energy rebates to help Americans make their homes more energy efficient, and new tax credits for lower and middle income Americans to buy new and used electric vehicles. It provides a bevy of tax credits to boost solar panels, batteries, and other technologies while discouraging emissions, and implements a new program that would make it more costly to emit methane, a potent greenhouse gas. So, I mean, this is how, it may sound when you're just reading like a general description, but when you get into the actual details here, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this is, significantly watered down relative to what it should be in terms of addressing what is, again, the single greatest threat facing the planet, facing humanity, and facing the United States right now. So in terms of what is actually in this bill, what is out of this bill, again, here from the Washington Post, Jeff Stein, they say tax credits for electric vehicles are in. So what are the actual details here? They say in recent months, Manchin has repeatedly voiced concerns about providing tax credits for Americans who purchase electric vehicles, saying that the subsidies could benefit foreign adversaries like China that dominate dominate the supply chain for EV batteries. So like, what the fuck kind of an argument is that? You're saying we shouldn't transition to using more electric vehicles or subsidize electric vehicles because that could help Chinese car manufacturers or Chinese electric vehicle battery manufacturers? What kind of point is that? I mean, number one, we should transition to using electric vehicles regardless of whether or not China happens to be the main producer there. But even if you want to compete with China on this front, then okay, pass legislation or include in this legislation bolstering domestic manufacturing of these electric vehicle batteries. So, on a number of different angles you could look at that. It seems like just a bizarre argument to make, but they continue saying, in light of these comments, it's notable that the package includes any EV tax credits, and the agreement would provide a $4,000 tax credit for consumers to buy used electric vehicles and up to $7,500 for new electric vehicles. And of course, it is going to be means tested here. They say for the new EVs, the income threshold would be $300,000 for joint filers and about $150,000 for single filers. So just completely unnecessary means testing. What kind of point is this saying? That people who happen to make slightly over $150,000 a year, that they shouldn't also be incentivized to get electric vehicles? Just doesn't really make any sense at all. But that's Joe Manchin pushing unnecessary austerity, just a classic move by him. But they also say that tax credits for clean energy are in the bill. The agreement also contains many of the tax credits for clean energy that have been championed by Senate Finance Chair Ron Wyden, who's usually pretty good on climate change, and that includes $30 billion for production tax credits to bolster U.S. manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals processing. So again, you were complaining up here that foreign adversaries like China are dominating the supply chain for electric vehicle batteries, but you're only giving $30 billion, or really a fraction of $30 billion, keep in mind, over the next 10 years to invest in critical minerals processing and batteries. I mean, like, again, if you actually believe in pushing back against the economic powerhouse of China, you would be investing a lot more than that. I mean, we're talking about over a 10-year period. So this is $3 billion per year being invested total in solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals processing. Okay, $3 billion a year. That's literally like a fraction of one of the aid packages that we sent over to Ukraine. I mean, just to put it in perspective, it's like, it's embarrassing at this point. But I guess they included some money for that, so that's a good thing, right? But they say $10 billion also for an investment in a tax credit to build clean energy or clean technology manufacturing facilities, such as factories that make electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels. So like roughly $4 billion a year over the next 10 years being invested total in these things. So again, you could say this is the biggest in history. I would say that we haven't done anything throughout history. You could say that this is, something instead of nothing. I would say it doesn't go, nearly far enough in addressing the issue, and the cost that we are going to have from not making a large enough investment right now is going to far outweigh even whatever radical proposal like the Green New Deal would cost in terms of economic consequences from climate change. So we're going to hear the arguments coming out over the next couple of days. I'm sure that they're going to champion this as like, the biggest piece of legislation in U.S. history. But they also say that in is a methane reduction program and a green bank. So a little bit of details on that. They say the package includes a methane emissions reduction program to reward oil and gas companies that slash their emissions of methane and penalize those who don't. So they're giving $775 million up front to oil and gas companies to cut their methane emissions. Okay, so they're giving them a fucking handout. They're giving them hundreds of millions of dollars in handouts to stop polluting the environment. The same oil and gas companies who have been lying for decades, not just to the United States, but to the global community about the consequences of fossil fuels in regards to climate change. And you are now basically getting on your hands and knees and not only begging them to stop destroying the environment, but giving them money to stop destroying the environment, as if these aren't profitable companies who could afford to pay for this themselves. I mean, again, I think that that's just completely ridiculous. Obviously, I do support in general terms, incentivizing a reduction in methane emissions, but it's just fucking pathetic that we live in a country right now, the most powerful country in the history of the world, and yet we are completely beholden to these massive fossil fuel companies who just get to dictate whether or not our entire environment is going to be destroyed. And in order for us to push back against their power, we have to offer them huge chunks of money. I mean, it's fucking pathetic. This is another perfect example of why we should be nationalizing our energy production instead of just having it be beholden to profit-driven entities. But they also say that out of this bill, so not included in this bill, is permitting reform reform in regards to like oil and gas leases for a lot of these fossil fuel companies. Apparently, they're going to be doing that in a separate bill in the next coming weeks or months, which is already just completely ridiculous. These oil and gas companies are sitting on literally hundreds, if not thousands, of leases that they are not using right now. They just want to grab an extra chunk for the future to ensure that they have dominance in this country, but apparently that's out for now, so I guess that's a good thing. They also say that out is a clean electricity program. They say, of course, Democrats already abandoned a pivotal program last year that would have punished electric utilities that didn't deploy more clean energy. The initiative, known as the Clean Electricity Performance Program, would have accounted for nearly 42% of the original bill's emission cuts, according to a chart released by Schumer's office. So they're not including a provision that would have accounted for 42% of the original bill's emission cuts. Okay, so again, they're taking huge chunks out of what could have been a substantial climate bill, okay, the one that was put forward by Joe Biden, which in and of itself didn't go far enough, but even that Joe Biden bill, they're taking massive, massive chunks out of it that are going to have disastrous consequences for the environment and for the future of our economic system. So, I mean, listen, in terms of the actual details here and the substance here, I'm sure they're going to be working out more details. We're going to learn more about this as it goes on, but I don't think this goes nearly far enough. I mean, let's be real about it. You're talking about, what, potentially, maximum $369 billion on energy and climate over the next 10 years. That's $37 billion per year on the single greatest threat facing humanity and the United States. I mean, $37 billion a year. Okay, again, that's less than we've sent in Ukraine, in aid to Ukraine. Okay, that's, a tiny fraction. It's like 1/25 of what we are spending on our military budget. Over that same 10-year period, we will spend at least, assuming that the military budget doesn't go up anymore, which it will, we will spend at least $8.1 trillion on our military over that same exact time frame. Okay, so 8.1 trillion versus 369 billion. Where are the priorities in this country? I mean, I think that that's pretty obvious, but this is what you get when you have a millionaire coal baron with direct financial stakes in maintaining fossil fuel production. Let him write your climate bill. I mean, this is what you're going to get from that. So I think that this is pretty pathetic. Wouldn't be surprised if a lot of congressional members of Congress, like members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, get on board with this, because it is something instead of nothing. But nonetheless, this is going to give, corporate Democrats, pro-fossil fuel Democrats, the opportunity to say that they did everything that they could on climate change, when that's just not the case. I mean, this is not going to go nearly far enough in terms of what the science is saying we need to do to mitigate the catastrophic consequences of climate change. And it's not even guaranteed that the provisions that are in this right now are going to actually end up in the final version of the bill. So we already have apparently some problems on the horizon here from Jeff Stein. He says it would be absolutely incredible to this if a $700 billion climate, energy, and healthcare and tax deal was scuttled by a $14 billion tax provision focused on private equity. So going back to that carried interest loophole that we were talking about earlier, it appears like Sinema, at least as of right now, has a problem with that. So Manchin is saying that is a must. We're not exactly sure about Sinema's position on this, but she has previously been against this. So this could be one of those things where, like, again, as he's pointing out here, a $14 billion tax cut to the wealthy could end up just completely tanking this entire bill. So that would be pretty funny if that's what ends up happening here. But also we have some problems in the House, not just in the Senate. He also says tax experts on both sides of the aisle agree that a SALT cap primarily affects the richest 5% of Americans. And of course, we have Senator Menendez saying that there are issues with Schumer and Manchin's reconciliation deal that should be addressed, namely lifting the SALT cap. And of course, Josh Gottenheimer in New Jersey is also going to have a problem with this. So listen, in terms of what we have right now in this bill, it is something instead of nothing. So good job, I guess. But again, this is a climate bill that is written and dictated by somebody who has a vested financial stake in maintaining fossil fuel production and destroying the planet. So, it doesn't go nearly far enough. It is something. So in terms of like the, outcome that this could have, it could be politically beneficial for Democrats, I guess. Yet to be seen exactly what Kyrsten Sinema wants to do with this bill, what, the corporate ghouls in the House of Representatives want to do with this bill. So it could be tampered down even more than what it is right now. But I don't think that this is anything dramatic to be celebrating. I mean, it is a step in the right direction, but the problem here is that they are not viewing this as a step in the right direction. They are viewing this as the end-all be-all, and potentially this is going to be the single last chance, assuming that Democrats potentially lose the House in the November elections. This could be literally the last chance that we have to make serious investments in climate change